Good evening. I'm Andrew Natsios, the Director of the Scowcroft Institute of International Affairs here at the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University. And I'd like to welcome you this evening to our special event, which is part of the 25th anniversary celebration of the founding of the Bush School. We are happy to present new perspectives on the George H.W. Bush presidency from former senior White House staff. Just before we begin, I'd like to introduce our Dean, Mark Welch. Dean Welch, thank you for coming. And is Greg Hartman here? I don't see him, so, pardon me? Okay. So, the order here is going to be, we have 4 people speaking virtually. That'll go on in a minute. And then 3 people speaking in person. And we'll alternate just for the sake of a little variety here. And each person is going to speak for 15 minutes. And I will get up at just before 15 minutes. And that is a signal to finish your sentence. We don't want to be here till 9 o'clock this evening, okay? So the idea of this is not just for us to be educated on how things were run, but we're hoping to do a transcription of this and do what there's an Institute of Politics at the Kennedy School, and what they do every presidential election is they have the campaign managers for all the campaigns come in, and they actually publish a book just based on the talks about how the campaign was run. I don't know if they still do that, but historians would use those books that were produced. Basically, it was a dialogue that was in book form. Now, we're not going to go that far here, but I thought it might be interesting and useful to transcribe what you all say this evening. So don't say things that you don't want to appear in print, okay? I do want to say you get to edit what you've written, so everybody wants to have that option. Can we turn on the virtual, please? Okay, there we are. So, our first speaker is John Sununu. Governor Sununu was the 75th governor of New Hampshire from 1983 to 1989, holding office for 3 successive terms. And from 1989 to 1991, John was the first White House Chief of Staff for President George H.W. Bush. He remained at the White House as counselor to the president until 1992. Thank you, John. I'll let you speak first. And by the way, everybody has very long CVs. I'm not going through everybody's CV, or we'll be here all this evening. So they're shortened bios. Thank you. John?
Thank you, Andrew. It is a pleasure to be part of this evening, looking back at a presidency that all of us who are going to speak tonight certainly are very honored to have been part of, the presidency of George Herbert Walker Bush. I thought tonight that what I would try to do was explain a little bit why I think there's something special about this one-term presidency. First of all, I think it's important for us to remember that coming into office, George Herbert Walker Bush was somewhat unique. He was a vice president succeeding a president immediately, and that has not happened any other time in modern history. It happened a couple of times, once or twice in the olden days, so to speak. But here was a vice president immediately following his president, and George Bush, because of that, had a very clear vision of what he wanted to accomplish and a very good idea of how he was going to do it. He came into office with a well-defined agenda. He came into office with an understanding of the kind of White House he wanted to have, and he knew what he wanted to accomplish. And even though he didn't know then he was going to be a one-term president, he was truly determined, I think, to get as much of it done in that first 4 years, if he could think of it as the first 4 years, as possible. The president was smart enough to understand that beyond an agenda, you need a team, and beyond a team, you need a process under which that team will operate. And certainly he was very much a part of trying to get those components put together. He got elected on November 8th, 1988, and on November 17th, he named me as Chief of Staff. Then he named Baker as Secretary of State and Scowcroft as the head of the National Security Council. And from that period on until Inauguration Day, the process was one of sharply defining in a way that he could communicate his agenda, in making the selection of the people that he wanted to be on the team, and then making sure that the White House would run as well as, or even better than the White Houses he was familiar with in the experience that he had in the past. He came in defining his agenda on December 26th. He gave me a handwritten copy, about 15 pages, of the issues that he thought he wanted to accomplish. And then he went himself and typed that up into about a 14 or 15 page memo, triple spaced, that he gave to the very first cabinet meeting on January 23rd, 1989. And in that he talked about what he wanted to deal with, issues like the budget, the environment, energy, education, immigration, crime, welfare reform. And then he talked about America's role for international leadership and how that had to be focused and enhanced. He talked about how he was going to deal with Europe, issues like arms control, Central America, and China. That was his detailed agenda. And under each one of those headings, he listed the items that he wanted to address and how he wanted to focus on. In putting the team together, he gave me some leeway. I would come to him during this transition period with my recommendations as to who should fill the key slots. And I think with only one or two exceptions, he showed enough confidence in my recommendations that that's what the team ended up being. And tonight you will hear from some of the key people that were so critical in putting together the results of what I think is probably the most successful one-term presidency, and frankly, I think even in one term, in terms of what it produced both in foreign policy and domestic policy. The president deserves credit for being way up there on the list of successful presidencies. A point that I often try to stress is that George Bush passed more impactful domestic legislation than any president at all, except perhaps Lyndon Johnson and Franklin Roosevelt. And even though he's known as primarily a foreign policy president, the academic community that seems not to have paid attention ought to be looking quite carefully at how successful his domestic policy packages were. Let me talk a little bit about process. Andrew mentioned when we chatted about what we might do tonight, that it would be good to talk about process. And I think the focus of what the president emphasized in everything when we discussed how we wanted the White House run was that he wanted a tone within the White House of collegiality. And so we tried very hard to create a system in which the team that was put together got to work with each other rather than either in isolation or, and it happens in some White Houses, not in concert at all. And so I think two components of what we did dealt with that. One was what I called the second most important meeting of the day. Just to give you an idea of how the White House runs in general on a timeline, I would get to the White House about 6 or 6:15. Andy Card usually beat me there by a half hour. And we would chat a little bit about what came in overnight, whether they were memos or news stories or whatever it was, to get an idea of what the day would look like. And at about 7:15, I had an open door policy, which I thought was important for the staff to know, that if any of them in the White House felt they had to come in and chat with the chief of staff, they could come in and talk. And if there was something I had to take to the president for them, if they felt they hadn't been able to see the president, then at least they would feel there was a short pipeline for them to communicate up to the president. And then at 7:30, the second most important meeting of the day would start, which was the staff meeting. And Andy and Roger and I and Jim were chatting a little bit before it started. It was a fairly freewheeling meeting with about 20 plus staff members, the senior staff of the White House, where we would come in and everybody in a short 30-second to a minute would talk about what under their purview was going to happen that day. And frankly, the important thing about that meeting as it evolved was not only the serious communication that took place, but frankly, the informal communication and the chatting that went back and forth from the folks that there. I think it created a camaraderie that served the president and the country well in the long run. The other meeting, the most important meeting of the day, was the meeting that the chief of staff, I as chief of staff, and Brent Scowcroft as the head of the National Security Council, and Dan Quayle as vice president met with the president. We got a CIA briefing. Scowcroft then spent about an hour talking about all the foreign policy stuff that had happened overnight and that would be happening that day. I talked for about a half an hour on the domestic side and what was happening with Congress. And then we had about a 40-minute back and forth amongst the four of us on whatever the president wanted to move the conversation to. And frankly, between those two meetings, I think the tone and the communication and the capacity to perform was defined in the George Herbert Walker Bush White House. The president passed a lot of legislation that has stood and withstood the review of time, if you will, from the Clean Air Act to the Civil Rights Bill, to the Americans with Disabilities Act, to the Budget Control Act, which really generated the surpluses that Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich like to take credit for. They're really George Herbert Walker Bush surpluses. And certainly the Energy Policy Act really set the foundation for America becoming energy independent. So in terms of agenda, in terms of the president gathering a team that truly was collegial, and in terms of the White House establishing a process that magnified that collegiality for him, allowed the president to have a staff that took the agenda that he had and dealt with all the process that's involved in a White House, from defining the policy to communicating the policy to the public and to the Congress, and then getting things put together. George Bush was a one-term president, but he was a great president, and he was a president that had long-lasting impact. And I'm really happy that tonight we're taking a legacy look back at what he accomplished and how his White House accomplished it. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, John. The next, we would like to welcome Chase Untermeyer to the stage, or to the podium. Chase is the former U.S. ambassador to Qatar. He served in the Texas House of Representatives before serving as the executive assistant to then Vice President George H.W. Bush from 1981 to 1983. Chase was later named assistant to the president and director of the White House Personnel Office under President Bush from 1989 to 1991. Chase.
Howdy. As Andrew just said, it was President Bush's choice that I should head the personnel office. And I've always warned people that anyone who has ever done that job never wants to do it again, but can never stop talking about it. So I leapt at the chance to be here tonight, but we are time limited, unfortunately. I have to say that, yes, it was a brutal, often searing experience to be the personnel czar, as President Bush liked to call me, but at the same time it was fascinating. It was like a super graduate level course in American government in which we dealt as a staff with every corner of the federal establishment. After all, it is a core presidential power. In fact, if you count up the words in the Constitution that describe what a president does, approximately a third of them relate to the appointment process in some form or fashion. I also learned quite a lot about the peculiar psychology of those people who want federal jobs and those who want to keep them from getting federal jobs. The raw human emotions are all at play in that particular line of work, and I'm talking about greed, hatred, revenge, and ingratitude. Take the time, for example, that President Bush said that he wanted something good for an old Navy buddy of his. So I looked through the book and I found something good, and I called up this fellow and I said, President Bush would be very honored if you would accept his appointment to the American Battle Monuments Commission. And the fellow said, well, tell me about it. I said, well, it's a very good commission, and not only will you enjoy it, but you get to take a trip to Europe once a year. And there was silence on the other end of the phone, and the fellow said, do you have anything that goes to Europe more often? And I said, yes, American Airlines. Now, there is an old saying that says that every time I make an appointment, I earn 9 enemies and 1 ingrate. Now, I'd read this quotation attributed to President Taft and Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia of New York. Once in an interview with Newsweek, they said I had said it. But no president, starting with George Washington, has ever liked making presidential appointments, even though it is a core power of the office. It means saying no to loyal supporters of the past, and it means saying yes for unavoidable political reasons to people who are totally undeserving, who may have actually been opponents of the president. I believe that one of the prime reasons that I had such a cooperative working relationship with Governor Sununu when he was chief of staff was that he had been a governor for 6 years and he had had to face the headaches of filling appointments. Now, there's all the difference in scale between the Granite State and the United States of America, but I would contend that the amount of political headaches in both jobs over appointments is the same. Now, the Reagan to Bush transition was the first one in 60 years in which a president of one party succeeded another president of the same party, other than through death or resignation, as Governor Sununu mentioned. The prior time was the Coolidge to Hoover transition of 1928, and in many ways that doesn't count because the federal government was so tiny compared to what it became in later years. I might say that the special problems of a transition of that sort is what to do with the appointees of the prior president who is a member of your own party. And it's for this reason that my experience was eagerly sought by the transition planners for Hillary Clinton in 2016, because had she been elected, she would have had to face the same circumstance. Now, I don't plan to say anything more about my own personal experience in presidential personnel. If you're at all curious, there are 300 pages of tales like this in Zenith, my book about the first Bush administration, which has been read by dozens of people throughout America. But I will assert that the Reagan-Bush administration model of running presidential personnel is the best for dealing with the tough task of filling out the ranks of a presidential administration. This involves having the office headed by an assistant to the president, the top rank, with an office in the West Wing, a person who reports directly to the chief of staff and occasionally to the president. The director assisted by a staff of individuals who themselves have held political appointments in the past and therefore know what it's like to represent an administration out in the departments and agencies. And then those people are assisted by many others who do the chief lifting of reading resumes and answering the phone. The ideal head of presidential personnel is someone known to have a close connection to the president, who enjoys his full confidence, and who can speak and act with authority. Two excellent examples of that would be Bob Tuttle, who was the personnel director in the second term of President Reagan, the son of Holmes Tuttle, one of the original Reagan supporters in California, and Clay Johnson, who held the job for the second President Bush, who had been his roommate in prep school. Now, this becomes important, as frequently happens, when the personnel director has to face down his natural enemy, and that is the cabinet officer. This is a tale of many tellings, but I would say that the chief struggle between the White House, meaning the personnel director, and the cabinet is that cabinet officers tend to look upon the various under and assistant secretaries who are working in that department as what they called my appointments. I wished I could wash every secretarial mouth out with soap every time I heard them claim that they had appointments, that the President of the United States was a mere clerk who would endorse what they happened to want at that particular time. I'd be happy to tell many a sad tale in the question and answer period, but let me say that as difficult as certain cabinet relationships were, there were all kinds of other potentates that the personnel director has to wrestle with and spend a lot of time on the telephone. And that means with U.S. senators, with governors, with party leaders, with big fundraisers, and with members of the president's family, which in the case of George H.W. Bush were quite a few people. Now, 60 years ago, it took John F. Kennedy only 2 months to fill out all the important ranks in his administration. But today, it has taken recent presidents upwards, if not more than a year. And I'm told that there was a slide to be shown at this particular point, but if it doesn't flash up on the screen, let me describe that it points out, among other things, that, yes, there you go. Forget about the horse race as to which president made more nominations more than someone else. The key point here is that by 6-month point after the administration began, and when the Senate goes out on recess, that all recent presidents have barely nominated half of the full-time, very important presidential appointments, again, versus John F. Kennedy's 2 months. You notice that the one who did the poorest among this is Donald Trump. If I have a chance, I will mention the various reasons why that particularly happened in his administration. But overall, this phenomenon that's displayed in the chart has 3 reasons behind it. One is the growth of the federal bureaucracy, which means more presidential appointments. Second was the lengthening of the forms that potential nominees have to fill out to detail their personal background and their finances. And then third is the Senate confirmation process. Now, in just the last 2 administrations alone, the Senate leader for the party's president, meaning Mitch McConnell under Donald Trump and Chuck Schumer under Joe Biden, have given priority to the confirmation of judges. And that's because the Senate's in session only a few days a week during the weeks they are in session at all. And judicial appointments have been the highest priority, which means that all those assistant secretaries and ambassadors and regulatory commissioners, et cetera, have to wait their turn. Well, I mentioned there were special issues involving the Trump administration. One of them was that he should have chosen whoever headed human resources for his company to be the head of presidential personnel. I imagine her to be a tough old broad named Maureen from Queens, who would have been probably uninformed about the federal establishment when she got the job, but she could have spoken with absolute authority for Mr. Trump. Instead, he chose a man from Tennessee named Bill Hagerty, who was a very successful businessman, who had been an appointee in the Tennessee state government, very well qualified. But the fact is, he was also the man with a plan. And his plan was to be in charge of presidential personnel only long enough to grab the ambassadorship to Japan, and then he was ambassador to Japan only long enough to come back home to Tennessee to run for the Senate. Today, he is the junior senator from Tennessee, and we can applaud Mr. Hagerty for his energy and his hustle and his dream, and I imagine he's doing a great job for Tennessee, but he didn't do a great job for Donald Trump. Trump then chose a fellow named John DeStefano, who had been also far from his political circle. He'd been an aide to John Boehner, the Speaker of the House. DeStefano turned out to be so talented, one of the very few most talented people in the White House staff, that they put him in charge of the political office and the office of public liaison, which meant the amount of time he could spend looking at presidential appointments was that much less. Trump made two other mistakes. One was that he didn't try to nominate people to go out into the departments and agencies to carry out his agenda. I believe that political personnel is the mandate of the American people made flesh and blood, which is to say that a president who comes into office wanting to make changes should try to fill out every possible job with supporters who are going to carry that message into the departments and agencies. Trump didn't do that. Another thing he did is he thought he had more control over people who were acting in a capacity than those who had been fully confirmed by the Senate. Frankly, this is entirely wrong because the department and agency bureaucratic personnel want a leader who is fully authorized to speak, not on tenterhooks waiting for the next call from the White House. Well, as I warned, it is hard to talk about presidential personnel briefly and dispassionately. I'm not seeking pity because I was rewarded with my own presidential appointment at the end of my tenure, and by something that President Bush told historian Mark Updegrove in 2012. Mark asked President Bush, "What was your proudest accomplishment in public office?" And President Bush could have talked about his naval service, he could have talked about the Americans with Disability Act, about ousting Saddam Hussein, about managing the end of the Cold War, but he said this: "I think we had an honorable administration. I think we were relatively scandal-free and blessed by a lot of good people, getting a lot of good people involved." So I will take that as more than enough satisfaction for having done the personnel job. Thank you.
Thank you, Chase. Our next speaker is Andrew H. Card. Andy served as the Deputy Chief of Staff in the Bush 41 White House, and then he served as the Chief of Staff to President George W. Bush, 43 as we call him, from January 2001 to April 2006. What is not here is that the two of us were elected to the Massachusetts House of Representatives the same year in 1974, so we've known each other for nearly 50 years. Actually, we ran and lost in 1972, so we met that the first time. That's where we met the first time. Okay, so Andy also served as Secretary of Transportation in the Bush 41 White House. He's served three presidents, President Reagan, President Bush 41, and President Bush 43. So he comes with a remarkable history. Andy.
Thank you very much, Andrew. It's an honor to be with you and the folks at Texas A&M. So I will do as Chase did and say, howdy. I'm thrilled to be part of this discussion. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be with John Sununu and Roger Porter and Jim Ciccone. And I'll start off by saying President George H.W. Bush, and remember when we worked for him, he didn't use the H.W. He was George Bush. When we served George Bush in his first term, and the term that made a difference, it was a remarkable experience because of the ethics and commitment that he brought to office and how he was contagious with wanting us to do the right thing. It was on January 12th, I think, before he even took the oath of office as president, that he sent marching orders out to everybody that was working on the staff or would be appointed to the staff or was working in presidential personnel or even who had been working at the campaign. And those marching orders were, and I'm going to quote from them, think big, challenge the system, adhere to the highest ethical standards, be on the record as much as possible, be frank, fight hard for your position. When I make the call, we move as a team, work with Congress, and represent the United States of America with dignity. And that's what he sent out to all of us who were helping him build an administration that would make a difference. And I can say that that commitment was truly infectious, and everyone on this Zoom experience that had the privilege of serving with him certainly lived up to the marching orders that he gave us, and we are proud of it. He also did something else. As Governor Sununu said, he came to office fully prepared to be president because He had been a vice president. He'd been a director of the CIA. He'd been almost an ambassador to China, the first envoy to China. He'd been chairman of the Republican Party. He knew what it meant to work in government. He knew what it meant to lead organizations. He knew what it meant to understand the burden of someone who works in the White House. And he was empathetic to those who work in government to help make a difference. And he also was very committed to understanding that the White House makes a lot of decisions, but they don't get to implement very many of them. Most of the policies that are implemented because of a presidential decision are implemented by the career employees and the political appointees at the departments of agencies. So he had great empathy for the working nature of government to live up to the expectations of a president, but more importantly, to the high standards that the American people would expect. So I was proud to do that. He also came to office knowing that people make a difference. And Governor Sununu was appropriate in describing how he helped the president build an administration of people that would make a difference. And Chase certainly led the effort to help screen people and nominate people or suggest they should be nominated for positions. And that was critically important. But people do make a difference. And the president was fortunate that some of the people that worked for Ronald Reagan, President Ronald Reagan, especially near the end, and remember, Jim Baker resigned as Secretary of the Treasury to help President Bush run successfully for the presidency. And Jim Baker, was succeeded at Treasury by someone that George Bush knew very well and had recommended for the position. So that was a very big deal. And Nick Brady made a difference as the Secretary of the Treasury for Ronald Reagan, and he continued in that position for George H.W. Bush. And so that was a significant, easy way to say, we're going to work together. This is not us doing something necessarily different than Ronald Reagan did or better than Ronald Reagan did. It's continuing to do what's best for the country and to make a difference. There were others like that. Dick Thornburgh was in the same situation. He had just been named Attorney General not that long before George Bush was elected president, and he continued to serve in that position under George Bush when he had been appointed by Ronald Reagan. And then Laurel Cavazos, the Secretary of Education at the time, had been appointed near the end of the Reagan administration, and he continued to serve as Secretary of Education under George Bush early on. He was then succeeded by Lamar Alexander. But the point is here that President Bush came to office really already understanding what it's like to be president. His learning curve was not steep, it was not high. He was well-grounded, and he encouraged us to be well-grounded in what we do and have the courage to speak truth to power. And I'm a witness of the phenomenal ability of John Sununu to speak truth to power. And he was very, very good at making sure that the president was given really good counsel that was not monolithic. It wasn't that George Bush just echoed the views of people in the White House. No, George Bush made decisions after having been well informed by a diverse group of people in the White House who had the courage to speak up. And Jim Cecconi was certainly a huge part of that. Jim Cecconi had the great burden of making sure that every document that went into the Oval Office came out of the Oval Office and it went into the public records and stayed there. So he was the policeman for making sure that nobody could end run the system. And Roger Porter was the first person that was working in the West Wing of the White House who had the responsibility for domestic policy and economic policy together. And he put together a wonderful team, and it was a complement with an E to the expectations the president had. So this group on this little Zoom call really helped the president do an awful lot of work that other presidents wouldn't have been prepared to do for months. And George Bush was prepared to do them literally on day one. I'll also shout out to someone who's no longer with us, Dick Darman, who played a huge role in that as the OMB director. But it was the senior staff, and Governor Sununu was right. The morning staff meetings were, number one, enjoyable. Number two, filled with respect. And number three, they produced results that were not monolithically developed. They were creatively developed, and that's what happened. So I say that I was privileged to be with George H.W. Bush for the entire tenure of his presidency. I was sorry that it was only 1 year. I was one of those people, yes, I want him to be reelected. But probably the greatest contribution that I saw him make as president was transitioning out of the presidency when he didn't want to leave it, but had to because the voters rejected him. And I was mightily impressed with how he organized a transition that helped Bill Clinton become president without having to climb a steep learning curve. And he really did a remarkable job. So, and I want to close this with one story. On January 6th of 1993, George H.W. Bush invited the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and the members of the Joint Chiefs, chiefs of staff, and their spouses to Camp David. And he also invited all of the Supreme Court justices and their spouses to Camp David. And he invited me and my wife, I was running the transition out of government to Camp David. And he also invited Vernon Jordan and Warren Christopher, who were running the transition for President-elect Clinton. And we attended church service. I remember George Strait, that great country western singer, was there and with his family. And President Bush got called out to deal with a problem with Saddam Hussein. So we were all waiting in the chapel. And then George Strait broke into "All my exes live in Texas." And it was a bizarre experience, but I was vitally impressed that President Bush, as he's getting ready to leave office, when he didn't want to have to leave office, in such a way that he was demonstrating the respect for the institutions of government that are so critical. The Supreme Court, our military leaders, and the rest of the executive branch of government, and he helped polish our democracy as he walked out the door, and I'll never forget that. So with that, thank you very much, Andrew. I love Texas A&M and the Bush School, as well as the Scowcroft Institute. Thank you for including me.
Thank you, Andy. So our next speaker is Fred McClure. Fred is the executive director of the Leadership Initiative at Texas A&M University. He had served as the assistant for legislative affairs to President George H.W. Bush and special assistant for legislative affairs to President Ronald Reagan. And in 1995, Governor George W. Bush appointed Fred as the Texas A&M University system to the Texas A&M Board of Regents, where he served as the vice chairman. Fred.
Howdy. Thank you, Andrew. It's a distinct pleasure to have the opportunity to visit with you this evening on this distinguished panel and reflecting upon what the duties were, pardon me, that I was charged with as Assistant to the President for Legislative Affairs. I'll go back, however, to when I first met George Bush. It was on January 16th, 1979, on Congress Avenue in downtown Austin, Texas, the day of the inauguration of Bill Clements as governor of the state of Texas. At the time I was working for our senator from Texas, John Tower, and we were walking back from the swearing-in ceremony, and Senator Tower turns to me and he goes, "Fred, have you ever met Ambassador Bush?" And I said, "No, I haven't." He goes, "Well, you are right now." And he grabbed Ambassador Bush and we met there on the streets on Congress Avenue in Austin, Texas. And almost exactly 10 years later, I had the opportunity on January 20th, 1989, to join him as a member of the senior staff and these guys and gals that I had the privilege of working with. So that part of my opportunity stems back to that fateful day when I had the chance to meet the guy that we dedicated our lives to for quite some time and still do actually to this day. I'll tell you a little bit about my job. The office was created in 1954 because President Eisenhower awakened after his midterm elections, and all of a sudden the Congress of the United States was not of the same political persuasion as was he. So the Office of Legislative Affairs was created. A guy named Bryce Harlow is given credit with starting the office, and it was 69 years ago, and it was described as a means to have a low-key approach to communicating the president's views to members of Congress. Only one person has held the Assistant to the President for Legislative Affairs job for an entire term of a presidency. Frank Moore, who did that with President Carter. I'm the second longest. I lasted 3 years and 3 weeks. And I think the reason for this high turnover is because it's much like the press secretary. You end up being in a position where you sort of have two masters, and you're communicating the views of the president to Congress, but Congress also wants you to communicate their views back to the president, since all 535 of them wake up each morning thinking they should be president. I think that probably the best descriptor of sort of like what the job was like was when Prince Philip and Queen Elizabeth came to visit the president for a state visit in May, I believe it was, of 91. And several of us, or actually all of the senior staff, was invited to at least kind of go through the receiving line and meet the Queen and Prince Philip. And it's sort of like the Queen, the President, Prince Philip, and Mrs. Bush. And so we get down, and I'm worried about whether or not I'm supposed to curtsy or grab her hand or bow low at the waist. I'm just wanting to get through the line without a major faux pas. And we get to Mrs. Bush, and she says to Prince Philip, meet Fred McClure. He handles my husband's relations with Congress. And I get it right with Prince Philip, and don't blow it. And then he looks at me and he goes, you must be the spear catcher. That, I think, was the best description of my job as Assistant for Legislative Affairs, or rather, maybe sometimes more like a ping pong ball. The Office of Legislative Affairs was actually strengthened, I guess, going back to the Nixon days. And the Nixon White House, the Ford White House, the Reagan White House, and indeed the Bush White House were all structured in the same fashion. There were people who served throughout or in a couple of those. So you might have somebody who had worked in the Nixon days, but they also helped with President Ford because of that transition. And some of those people came back to help with President Reagan. I do remember, though, the advice I got from one distinguished member who worked for Nixon and Ford. He said to me, Fred, just remember this, because part of our job is counting votes. We're trying to figure out how we can get to 51 or 60 or 67, as the case may be, or 218 or 290, depending upon what the circumstances are in the House of Representatives. And then this dear friend said to me, whom I'd known throughout those years, he goes, McClure, you got this job now. Just remember this, they all lie. As long as you remember that, you'll be okay, and you'll be able to figure it out. But the organizational structure was designed in much the same way. And like has been alluded to earlier, we had some holdovers because you couldn't get all 15 people or 20 people all on board all at once. And we said because it was not a hostile takeover between the Reagan and the Bush administrations, we had some folks that hung on for a couple of days to kind of help us buy time because Congress was going to start working anyway, and we needed all the people that we could get. Governor Sununu, I think probably some of this comes from the fact that he comes from New Hampshire, but we started with a rather austerity move, which the governor may remember. I'm sure my colleagues remember in terms of what staffing was going to be like. In other words, I ended up with one fewer person that we had on each side lobbying the Congress for the House and for the Senate than we had during the days with President Reagan when I was there. But with one exception, all of the people, the 3 deputy assistants to the president and the 5 special assistants to the president, with one exception, we had all worked together either on the Hill or in the private sector, and they were people that I knew and knew well. And that one member of the team that fell out of that characterization came with the highest of recommendations, and we were able to put together, I think, a pretty good team to represent the president. My kind of rule of thumb, my underlying principles, if you will, in terms of the relationship with my team was, number one, no surprises. No surprises. To make sure that everything that was on the table needed to be on the table as we were going down the path of trying to get legislation enacted or legislation stopped that the president did not want. And in turn, the deal was also, I will be loyal to you. And I expect that loyalty to work both ways. And there will be times, and there were times, where people on my staff took one position and members of Congress took another position as to what happened in a particular exchange. And it was important for those members of my team to know that we had their back. We had weekly staff meetings that also included legislative folks from OMB and legislative folks from the National Security Council. And those weekly meetings allowed us to talk about what activities we had down the road. I also divided the team up in such a fashion that they had subject matter expertise. So if it was something having to do with the American with Disabilities Act, then a person in the House team and a person in the Senate team were each charged with that responsibility, and they in turn worked with Roger Porter's group at the Domestic Policy Council from the standpoint of knowing what issues were on the table and who we were dealing with. We had a thing that we jokingly call white towel duty. White towel duty basically meant when members of Congress came to the White House to see the president or to be involved in any sort of meeting, a congressional meeting, we had to do the white towel duty, put it over your arm, and be there to make sure the members of the Congress and Senate felt as though they were welcome, and to also, get some face-to-face time with them, because that was what we cherished most of all. I do remember the day that Senator Strom Thurmond, at the age of 98 or 7 or 6, got down and showed me how he did push-ups. And he just kind of did it right there in the reception room, right outside the cabinet, which was quite a sight. Quite a sight. But regularly need to try to make sure that these staff members were involved in those meetings so that the members of Congress would realize that when they were talking to one of the special assistants or to the deputy assistant, that they were talking to people who were go-to folks on our team. And in turn, we worked with the political affairs folks when members of Congress were traveling with the president on Air Force One, worked with them to make sure that we could cover all the bases. The president and Governor Sununu made a commitment to me. This kind of gets a little bit into Chase's space, that assistant secretaries of legislative affairs hopefully would have my blessing. And fortunately, I only had to pull that card one time, and I won. They backed me up. It was one of those things where if these are the people who are going to be promoting the president's legislative program before Congress on behalf of cabinet agencies, we want to make sure that they have the loyalty level, not to their cabinet secretary, but to the broader cause of what the president wanted to accomplish in his agenda. And those are the kinds of people that we wanted there. Cabinet Assistant Secretaries for Legislative Affairs regularly communicated with us. We had a weekly legislative report to the president. It was like what went on this week, what we expect next week, who's going to be on Capitol Hill testifying, what we expected down the road, what kind of big vote hurdles we're going to have. And it also included information about what kind of a sampling of what members of Congress were writing in about, because my office also handled all correspondence with members of Congress. A lot of times they'd write the president and they'd get a letter back from me, which I know they thought was real cool. In fact, it almost got me in trouble at one point because I didn't know that I had told them that I had responded in that fashion. But all in all, I think we put together a group that allowed us to communicate in a low-key way the views of the president with the Congress of the United States. A lot of times we had to do things by veto. In fact, a whole lot, since we never had control of either house of Congress during the president's presidency. And we had 23 of them during my tenure, and none of those 23 were overridden. I left the White House and he got overridden, but not my fault. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred. Next up is Jim Ciccone. Jim served as the assistant to President Bush and as staff secretary in the White House from 1989 to 1990. Prior to those roles, he served as special assistant to the president and special assistant to the chief of staff, Jim Baker, in the White House during the Reagan presidency from 1981 to 1985. Jim.
Thank you, Andrew. Maybe just to describe the job a little bit, in effect, you're the president's inbox and outbox. That was really my function. I got to say no almost as many times as Chase Untermeyer, but it's an old job. It originated under Lincoln. There's ever since Lincoln, there's been one or two people with the title of secretary to the president. For a long time, it was called that. To help him with his paperwork, in essence. As Andy and Governor Sununu described, President Bush felt very strongly about having a process with integrity. He had worked in government, as you know. He had been vice president for 8 years. And like his predecessor, Walter Mondale, and unlike every previous vice president, he was in the paper flow in the White House. And the person that had my job in the Reagan White House, Dick Darman, was told by President Reagan to ensure that. And so he came to the office not only well prepared, but very well versed in how a White House should function, and the importance of a process with integrity. He came in also with the information available to him from his previous 8 years about all the issues going on in the government. And I think that served us well in getting off to a very good start. When right after Governor Sununu called me and told me that I was meeting with the president-elect the next morning, I went in there and spent half hour or more with him, with him describing to me not only the job he wanted me to do, but how he wanted me to do it. And I keep coming back to that word integrity. My job was to ensure that that I kept track of all of the issues, foreign and domestic, including national security issues, flowing through the White House, in and around there, making sure that when they went to the president, they were actually ready for him. And when they did go to him, he wanted me to make sure that he had all of the views of his senior team in the White House, as well as with David Bates's help, the relevant members of his cabinet on any issue, so that when he made the decision, it was very well informed, and he had all of those views. He also had the ability and often did pick up the phone to actually talk to some people who had views on an issue before he made a decision. Then once he made a decision, it was my job to track it. He had been in and around government long enough to know that just because a president makes a decision doesn't mean it actually happens. And I see Fred smiling there. I think all of us have been through this and understand that part of it. I remember he told me that on any issue where he's made a decision, he said he keeps a checkbox in his mind, and he needed me to let him know when it got done so he could kind of close that file in his brain. So it really was not just a function of getting the information to him, but making sure that when he made a decision, that it was actually implemented, and that we were tracking that, and we knew who had responsibility for it, and that we reported back to the president on that. And obviously, in doing that kind of job on a daily basis, I had to interact with almost everybody on the staff, especially with Governor Sununu and also with Andy in doing it. But importantly, the president himself felt so strongly about the process that if somebody was meeting with him and handed him a piece of paper, he'd take it very graciously, as he always was, but he wouldn't look at it. He'd send it out for me to staff it and make sure that before he formed an opinion on it, that he had the views of all of his top people. I think Governor Sununu made the point that we all knew each other. I knew Governor Sununu from when I was practicing law and I was dealing with the nuclear power issues. And New Hampshire happened to have a nuclear power plant that served it. But we also, worked together in the campaign in 1988. I'd worked closely with Andy and Fred and Roger and others on the team here in the Reagan administration, either working for President Reagan, as some of them did, or working for Vice President Bush, with that whole team being well integrated with the White House staff at the time. So just like the national security team, which I know the Scowcroft Institute is very well versed in how important the collegiality and friendships were between Bush and Baker and Scowcroft and Cheney and Powell, the fact that they had worked together with each other over the years and become friends. I think everybody understands how crucial that was to the foreign policy successes of the administration. I think that was equally true in terms of the collegiality of the senior White House staff, as John and Andy have described. We all knew each other. We had worked together for years. We had gotten to be friends, and more important, we all knew President Bush. And I guess maybe even more important than that is President Bush knew us. He had been around us. He had seen us working. We had worked with him. He had worked with some of us on his campaign, some in the Reagan administration, some of it is in his prior jobs. So everybody on the senior team, he knew well. He knew our talents, and if we had shortcomings, he knew that too. And I think he and John did a great job of placing all of us in positions with a process that kept us all working closely together. You mentioned the senior staff meetings, but just hallway conversations and things like that. This wasn't a place with rivalries or backbiting or things of that nature among the staff. And I think it was one of the big reasons that we were all able to hit the ground running, and we had to in 1989 when we were going through the transition. We were in the midst of the savings and loan crisis, which a lot of people forget about, but was a major systemic threat to the financial system in the country and the banking system. And it had to be dealt with, and it was going to be one of the first things we had to deal with. And I can't talk about that without mentioning one of the unsung heroes of that, who was Richard Breeden. George Bush asked him to take responsibility for it, put a team together, put legislation together. And in 1989, that same year, we were able to craft and pass legislation. I think it was called FIREA at the time, but it was the Financial Institutions Recovery Act. And it basically, I think, helped save the financial system from a major crisis and a major downturn. And I don't think we would have been able to do that without George Bush's knowledge of those issues from his time as vice president, his ability to focus on what were the two or three most important issues at any given moment, and then getting the right people in place, delegating responsibility to them, staying on top of it himself, but then ensuring that they had all of the support that he could provide them to bear on the task. And I think that was one where I don't think President Bush gets nearly the credit he should, because it was a challenge. It was a major crisis that was effectively dealt with, and the dire consequences everyone predicted were averted. I could also mention the budget crisis. This was clearly the major issue of the moment, and at great political cost to himself. President Bush worked with Congress to craft a package that brought about, I think, John, you'll correct me if I misstate this, but cut the deficit by about $500 billion over 5 years. And it set the stage for one of the greatest periods of economic growth this country has had that lasted, for another 10 years. And others were able to bask in that, but it was really President Bush and his courage that I think was able to bring that about for the country. We worked very hard on the Clean Air Act and major amendments to the Clean Air Act to modernize that. Americans with Disability Act, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was the first major agreement to deal with the climate change issue. He signed the first immigration reform of immigration laws that had happened in 50 years. All of these things, I think, I'm leaving out, a long list of things, but I think they, along with his well-known foreign policy accomplishments, I think there is a very strong case to be made that President Bush accomplished more in 4 years than most presidents have accomplished in 8. I think a lot of that has to do with not just the team he put together, but the type of person George Bush was. The first thing I'd lay out in that is he was incredibly smart. He didn't wear it on his sleeve like some people, but he was a very, very smart man. He was able to hold incredible amounts of information in his head at any one time on a huge variety of different subjects. And at the same time, not personally get overwhelmed by that, like I think some presidents may have been. He was able to not just deal with those, but also from among those things, again, recognize, identify the top 2 or 3 things where it required most of his attention and focus as president. And I think he did that very well. He was an incredibly conscientious worker. I was blessed to see that so much. He's a clean desk guy. You'd send him paper and you would get it back, and you would get it back with his comments on it and instructions. I gave him homework to take to the residence with him every evening. I'd get buzzed at about 6:30 every morning to come up and collect the stuff that he had stayed up working on, and brought it back every day. If he'd go to Camp David on the weekend, he took huge amounts of files and paper with him, and brought it all back. It didn't disappear into some black hole or get scattered around the office. If you gave him things to read or react to, he read them and he reacted, and you got it back very promptly. He also knew himself, and I think he had been in responsible positions a long time, and I think he knew his own talents and strengths. I think he maybe overstated some of his weaknesses. I think he always felt he was a very poor public speaker, and I don't think he was at all. But I think following Ronald Reagan, I think he was a little self-conscious on that, for example. But overall, I think he was a genuinely warm, trustworthy person. I think it was one of his greatest strengths as a leader. And I think that this entire group getting together 30 years later, we're still in love with the guy. And I think so is everybody that's ever worked with him in any sort of senior position. So thank you for the opportunity to be with you today, even if it's virtual.
Our final speaker before we have questions. By the way, you can write your questions on the cards, which I think you should have gotten on the way in. Did they get the cards, Hayden? Yes. Write your questions and then send them to either end of the row, and Bush ambassadors will collect them and give them to me, and then I'll go through them. Many of them may be somewhat repetitive, so I have to go through them as we're talking. But our last speaker is none other than Roger Porter, who I think, you're still a professor at the Kennedy School, Roger? Is that true?
David Bates is going to speak before I do.
Pardon me? Oh, David, I'm sorry. I've got the order wrong. I apologize, David. So David Bates has 40 years of experience in politics, government, business, and law. He was President Bush's personal aide during his first campaign in 1978. In fact, I think that's when we met, when you were in Boston, 78, 79. Spent time in the Departments of Commerce and Treasury from 1981 to 86 in the Reagan administration in international trade, working with Bush's 1988 presidential campaign and the vice president's office. Following President Bush's successful election in 1988, he served as assistant to the president and secretary to the cabinet. The rivalry between the cabinet is always a big thing in all administrations. And served as President Bush's chief of staff in 1992. David. Sorry. No problem. Getting confused. Yeah.
Thank you, Andrew. I think you gave me a promotion on the last, on the 1992, but anyway, but thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be at the Bush School and to commemorate this 25th anniversary. And it's always a pleasure to talk about our late, great president, and in a time, to borrow the title of one of Chase's good books, a time when things went right. And let me say, it's also a pleasure just to be with my friends and former colleagues. When I first talked to President Bush about being Secretary of the Cabinet or Cabinet Secretary, the thing he emphasized to me was, I want my cabinet to feel included, always feel a part of the team. And I think he was particularly solicitous of the cabinet's feelings because he was a former cabinet member in two different presidential administrations. So I just kind of, that was my North Star and how I tried to go about doing my job. Governor Sununu and Andy were always helpful to me in doing my job, which I appreciated. The president spent a lot of time with his cabinet. Once a month, he would try to have lunch with a different cabinet member. He did it in the Oval Office study. Governor Sununu and I would be there. I remember Boyden came when Attorney General Thornburg, when the lunch was with Attorney General Thornburg. Our first year in office, I believe it was May of 1989, the president invited the cabinet and their spouses to a dinner in the Rose Garden, and it was just a very, very special occasion, beautiful spring night. He also invited I think probably the summer of '89 or maybe early fall of '89, he invited the cabinet and spouses to Camp David. Had them on a Saturday, and during the afternoon they shot, skied, or swam, or played tennis. I can remember Jack Kemp in a spirited doubles match with his shirt off, and Mrs. Bush bit her tongue. But the activities were followed by a dinner in the main lodge at Camp David. Another very special. Very special occasion. 2 to 3 times a year, he would try to meet with his sub-cabinet agency heads. That's, GSA, OPM, OPIC, NASA, National Endowment for the Humanities, and he'd have a lunch in the Roosevelt Room. He'd usually open the lunch with 5 minutes of remarks, welcoming remarks, and then he'd go around the table and have each agency head for 5 minutes talk about the focus of their agency, what their objectives were, and any challenges they were having. I also know that Governor Sununu every 2 or 3 months would try to have a breakfast with the cabinet, and as I recall, the governor usually had a couple items he wanted to impart, but it was mostly just an open discussion, free-flowing discussion. President even had, I know this in our first year, he even had the head of the regulatory agency, the independent regulatory agencies, over to a reception in the mess. It was just a cocktail reception, no discussion of substance, since we couldn't talk to the independent regulatory agents about substance. But I don't even think I went to the event. I think Boyden was Boyden Gray, our counsel to the president, was the staff officer. I tried to keep the cabinet departments, with the help of my staff, informed of everything that was going on at the White House. After Governor Sununu's 7:30 staff meeting, I would meet with my staff. Each one of my staff members had about 3 or 4 agencies that they were responsible for staying in constant communication with. Their contacts were usually the chief of staff. But after Governor Sununu's meeting, I would meet with them, tell them about, what our main event of the day was, what message we were trying to drive with that event. And usually at our staff meetings, we might discuss other things that news that had arisen, and what Marlon was going to say at his press briefing about it. I would relate that. We also had a cabinet report that went to the president every Friday. I'd gotten the idea for this when I was at Treasury. Secretary Regan had asked for a management report from his assistant secretaries every Friday. And I was in an area of Treasury that had some oversight of customs and alcohol, tobacco, and firearms and foreign assets control. And we would ask for their management report on Thursday. And we learned a lot from it, and it really helped us in doing our job working with those agencies. And so we started this cabinet report, and we asked the cabinet departments to get us their reports every Thursday. What it was basically any big developments in their department that happened that week, and any major kind of development, any major undertakings the following week. Such as major regulatory announcements or travel by the secretary and the like. I had a staff member named Michael Jackson who did yeoman's work in putting these together. He later became, in Bush 41 administration, became Andy Card's deputy. He became the deputy secretary at Transportation under Andy. But Michael would pull those together. He'd get all those different cabinet reports. He would take the key highlights from each department and summarize them for the report to the president. And he read it religiously. And a couple of times I didn't get it to Jim to make the last Friday run out to Camp David. I would get a call Saturday morning, where's that cabinet report? And I think, along with the excellent briefing my colleagues, Governor Sununu, were always giving him, I think it really helped the president be, at least to my mind, one of the most knowledgeable and conversant presidents about what was going on in his administration that I'm aware of. And in terms of the policy, the cabinet policy making bodies, of course there was the NSC, and we had the Economic Policy Council and the Domestic Policy Council, and I'm going to let Roger leave that in Roger's good hands to talk about those. One anecdote that shows how inclusive the president was of his cabinet. We had early in the administration, Economic Policy Council matter, agricultural export enhancement program, and I'm sure it was a subsidy we introduced back prior to our administration in response to one of our trading partners' subsidies. But the question was whether we would get rid of the subsidy or phase it out over. And an options paper was developed by the working group, which is assistant secretaries in conjunction with the White House staff. And then the president met with the Economic Policy Council members to talk about talk about the options paper and talk about what to do. He said at the meeting, I'm not going to, make a decision now. Let me read the paper again and let me think about this. Well, after the meeting, he invited to lunch the 3 cabinet members that were most involved in the issue, which was Bob Mossbacher of the Secretary of Commerce, and Carla Hills, our trade representative, and Clayton Yiter, our agriculture secretary. Invited them to lunch in the Oval Office study and talk more about it. And then I think he took another day or two. I'm sure he talked to Roger again and to Governor Sununu, and then he made his decision. Our full cabinet meetings, those worked very similar to the Reagan administration. Same for our full cabinet meetings, which were more informational and kind of coordination meetings. We held those on average about once a month. The type of things Dick Darmond would talk about the budget process, when cabinet departments were going to need to get their budget submissions in, and what the pass-back and appeals process for the departments was going to look like. Michael Boskin would give periodic updates on the economy. I remember Sam Skinner briefing the cabinet on the Exxon Valdez cleanup. The president would debrief the cabinet after a G7 meeting, and Secretary Baker the same after a meeting of foreign ministers. I even remember the president briefed the cabinet on Tiananmen Square. And obviously our substantive response to Tiananmen Square was decided in the National Security Council what sanctions we were going to impose. But the president wanted the cabinet to know why we were taking the actions we were, and what we were saying publicly about the matter. And I think that is, I think that's all those things are all those items that those cabinet members are good for these secretaries to have, because they traveled a great deal. They were going around the country promoting the president's and the administration's agenda, and that were in their and the items that were in their portfolio, and they were invariably doing press availabilities when they in their travels, and of course the local press is going to ask them about the particular policy program they were espousing, but there would be inevitably questions about just major issues that were affecting the administration, and it was good for these secretaries to know the president's feeling on these major issues. So, let me just close by saying I think that our cabinet was worked very well among themselves. They worked well with the White House staff, and I think there are a couple reasons for that. One, the president, with Chase's help and Governor Sununu's help, appointed high-quality people and people of high character. And secondly, I think just the president he led by example. I mean, he was the ultimate team player, and whenever things went right in the administration, it was always my administration, or we did this, or my administration did this. Whenever the few times that there was a hitch or some problem, that's the only time he would use the I word. But I think he always treated everyone very openly and directly and with respect and honestly. He never played games, didn't play people off against one another, and I think he just engendered a lot of I know he engendered a lot of loyalty among us and among the people that served for him, the cabinet secretaries and the people that served underneath in the departments, and so anyway, that we were all just very, very fortunate to serve for him as we did. Thank you, Andrew.
Now we have our final speaker. Roger Porter served as Assistant to the President for Economic and Domestic Policy from '89 to '93. He served as the Director of the White House Office of Policy Development in the Reagan administration and Executive Secretary of the President's Economic Policy Board during the Ford administration. It is true that you are still a professor at the Kennedy School?
Yes, I would like to be there now, but I have to be in class early tomorrow morning. So
Okay.
I'm still
So,
teaching.
you are a rival, but we're welcoming you this evening, we're welcoming you this evening, Roger, despite the institution which you're at now. But thank you very much for being with us. So,
Thank you very much. Well, it's a delight for me to be part of this assessment of the George H.W. Bush administration and to spend time with treasured colleagues and to look back on some days that all of us remember fondly. It's a big challenge to be objective about anything that you were involved in. And I see each of us has struggled to do that. But I'm going to make the effort as my colleagues have, and want to remind us all of three things that were quite distinctive about the Bush 41 presidency. As Chase has pointed out, he's the only newly elected president since Herbert Hoover was elected in 1928 to succeed someone from the same political party. Most presidents tend to come into office, newly elected presidents, by defining themselves in part in contrast with their predecessor. And that's easy to do when you have a change of party. But since the end of the Second World War, we have only had one occasion in which a party was able to win 3 consecutive elections, when Ronald Reagan won in 1980 and 84, and George Bush won in 1988. He is also was also the first incumbent vice president to be able to win election since Martin Van Buren in 1836. Richard Nixon, Hubert Humphrey, Al Gore, all tried and failed in subsequent years. But the third thing that is less well, I think, appreciated about the context in which George H.W. Bush came into office is that he faced the largest opposition majorities in the Congress of any elected president in U.S. history. Fred McClure knows this well because he didn't have the numbers in either the House or Senate to produce a working majority, as Reagan had in 1981 when he came in with a Republican majority in the Senate and a working majority in the House, which was lost in the 82 midterm elections, and then the Senate was lost in 86. So when George H.W. Bush won in 1988, he came into office without much in the way of coattails, and therefore faced a legislative situation in which he had to deal with an opposition Congress. It is commonplace today to observe and use the phrase in both the public and private sectors, tone at the top. And many this evening have discussed the tone that President Bush set for his administration by his words and by his example. I found him to be, as others who have spoken tonight, an unusually modest man for the incredible accomplishments that he has had in his life. I could detect no trace of arrogance in his manner or in his thinking. He had a deep commitment to public service. And shortly after coming into office, toured each of the cabinet departments to hold a meeting, David Bates will remember this, to hold a meeting in the various auditoriums and to thank the career civil servants for the work that they did and to encourage them in the public service that they were rendering. He had a deep sense of integrity. You needed to know that the numbers that you were giving him were defensible. He was also highly accessible to those who worked with him, and that accessibility was facilitated by his chief of staff, John Sununu, and his deputy, Andy Card. He had an abiding willingness to try to search for and find common ground. He did not question the motives of others. He always conveyed a tone of civility. He wanted to have what he used to describe as an honorable administration. And this is a man who was very smart, who graduated Phi Beta Kappa from Yale, and who set a standard, both in the way he thought, the way in which he approached problems, and the way in which he conducted himself, that was an incredibly powerful way of conveying what is often referred to as the tone at the top. He was very fascinated with the idea of people working together as a team. And he selected people who had worked with one another before, who knew one another well, and who had a respect and regard for one another. In such situations, there is always the danger of what Victor Janis called victims of groupthink. But there was no groupthink in the Bush 41 White House. He was very comfortable in having people convey their ideas in meetings and in having strong and spirited discussions. He wanted each option explored and examined and given its due. And it was also a White House that remained what I call attached to reality. Sometimes within the context of the White House, people live in a cocoon and they're seemingly disengaged from what is going on outside. That was not the kind of White House that he established and that he maintained. And finally, there is often some tension between the people who have principal responsibility for formulating policy and the people who have principal responsibility, as Fred McClure did, for implementing policy and getting the legislation passed. And I think one of the key features of the Bush White House is that those two groups worked very closely with one another. We had a standing order in our office that no one went to Capitol Hill without taking someone from the Office of Legislative Affairs with them, or if that was not possible, immediately reporting back so that Fred and his people knew what was being done by those of us who were going up to discuss policy issues with senators and representatives on the Hill. Jim Ciccone ran a process as staff secretary, one of the most challenging, and I would argue one of the most important jobs in the White House, in a way that was widely viewed as fair. And I had the opportunity to work in the Ford and Reagan and Bush administrations with 6 different chiefs of staff. I know of no chief of staff who was more accessible than John Sununu, and if you couldn't get a hold of John for some reason, Andy Card. And I think that engendered a wealth of confidence that people could have their views expressed and taken to the present when necessary. And those kind of relationships were very important. Presidents come in, as John has pointed out, with an agenda in their mind and great ambitions. And yet they have to deal with reality. And a large number of things that they have to deal with are what's happening in the world the way it is. Just consider in 4 years some of the challenges that President Bush faced. The need to take out Manuel Noriega in Panama and the invasion there. Tiananmen Square in China, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the disintegration of the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe, followed by the disintegration of the Soviet Union itself, the reunification of Germany within NATO over the initial objections of both Margaret Thatcher and Francois Mitterrand and Mikhail Gorbachev. And not least, dealing with the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait and putting together what at the time was the largest coalition of countries to oppose this invasion and to repel the Iraqi forces from Kuwait. In terms of the economy and domestic policy, as John Sununu has pointed out, he inherited a very challenging situation with respect to the budget and an economy that was in the 7th year of a recovery and was starting to slow. And in the very first year, we got only about half of the spending restraint that we had proposed in that first initial budget. And it looked very likely that budget deficits were going to double in the next year. And so President Bush had a very difficult, challenging situation. I've rarely seen anyone agonize as much as he did about what to do with respect to the budget deficit, because there had been bipartisan coalitions put together in 1982, 1984, and 1987, all of which had included restraint on the rate of growth of spending along with revenue increases. And it was very clear that the Democratic Congress was not going to have another budget deficit reduction package of any size or shape that did not include both spending restraint and revenue increases. And as a result, he finally decided to go ahead and negotiate the package that he did in the budget agreement of 1990, largely because he was persuaded that we could get introduced two essential elements, what were known as spending caps and a pay-go system, which if you were going to exceed a spending cap, you had to match it with a spending cut somewhere else or an increase in revenue. And as many economists have pointed out, this single act, which was the largest deficit reduction act in US history, was maintained by his predecessor when he came into office, did not destroy the budget caps, and over the next 6 years, we were able as a country to work our way out of the budget deficits that occurred. And in the last 2 years of that century, actually have budget surpluses. But the budget was only a part of what was being done. As has been pointed out, we had to deal with a savings and loan situation, education, the environment, immigration, energy, childcare, the Surface Transportation Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act. Historians who go back and look at the kind of legislation that was passed will note that in terms of volume, it was very high. And I think in terms of the quality of it is very high. And I would support the argument that the quality of it was very high by virtue of the fact that it was largely passed on a bipartisan basis, and that in fact, it was rarely, if ever, overturned by future administrations. It was kept in place. In large part, this is because of the veto strategy that he developed. As Fred pointed out, as long as he was there was never a single veto overridden. In fact, the record was 43 out of 44. We did lose the cable television re-regulation vote in late 1992, but rarely have presidents had as much success in utilizing their veto, not to stop things or simply to stop things, but often I call them catalytic vetoes, which bring you back to the negotiating table. And we issued 937 statements of administration policy, which laid out before senators or representatives voted on the floor, but the administration's position was what changes were absolutely must, A-type changes, what changes were we would prefer, but the bill would not be vetoed if those changes were not made. If those changes were not made, the bill was vetoed. We went back to the negotiating table, and with over 1,000 hours of help from a research assistant, gone back and looked at those 937 statements of administration policy and discovered in the subsequent administration negotiations, the administration prevailed over 75% of the time on the type A veto threat, and 63% of the time on the ones where we said this is our preference, but we are not going to veto it if it is not made. In short, he had an extraordinarily skillful use of his biggest legislative power, the power to veto, and to get the Congress, a highly partisan Congress, back to the negotiating table to produce this bipartisan outcome. In short, I share my colleague's view that what animated the Bush administration as much as anything was someone who led by his great commitment to country, to public service, and to others. Many people, when they get to the top of the ladder, at the head of the organization, become rather self-absorbed and self-conscious. I never saw that once with George H.W. Bush. One last anecdote, David Bates will appreciate this since he was often President Bush's tennis partner. I first met him on the tennis court because I was President Ford's favorite partner. And I got a call on a Saturday morning and said the president wanted to know if you would be available to play tennis at 1 o'clock this afternoon. And I said, yes, who are we playing? And he said, well, George, Bush is back from China. He's going up next Tuesday for his confirmation hearings as CIA director. And the president knows how much he likes to play tennis, and so he's invited him over. I went out, got there early. George Bush got there early. We started warming up and got into the match. I tell you, these guys who make it to the top of the political ladder are incredibly, intensely competitive. President Ford kept turning to me and saying, get this point, get this point. And I'll never remember, we were changing ends of the court. We were up 5-4 in the first set. It was my turn to serve, and the president turned to me and said, don't let me down, partner. So after the match was over, the president went back in there, and George Bush turned to me and he said, can you get this court? There's only one court at the White House, and there's a list of people who are eligible to schedule it. And I said, yes. And he said, well, if I get through my confirmation hearings as CIA director, can you get yourself a partner? And I said, sure. And he said, well, I'll give you a call. The day after he was confirmed, I got this call and he said, this is George Bush. Do you remember me? And I said, yes. And he said, can you get the court? And I said, yes. And he would bring Jim Baker as his partner most of the time, who was then Deputy Secretary of Commerce. And I would have my boss, Bill Seidman, and we would play each week. That's how I ended up getting to know and later work with him during his years as vice president, during the Reagan administration, and then during his own presidency. I put a lot of stock in how people call lines in tennis. There are no linesmen, there are no monitors, and sometimes in the quest for victory, people are willing to give themselves the benefit of the doubt. But I can honestly say, I do not recall a single time when I had reason to question a call by George Bush. If the ball was close, he called it in. And I think that says a lot about him, and it says a lot about the integrity with which he approached the office and the way in which he dealt with those of us privileged to serve along with him. Thank you.
So if you could move your cards down, we'll ask some of the questions that you have. But in the meantime, I want to ask a question of Fred and maybe Ron, maybe all of you can answer. I did not know it was the most partisan Congress, not partisan, but in terms of numbers, the most hostile in, you said American history, but
Well, of any newly elected president.
new elected president. Okay.
175 to 260 in the House, 55-45 in the Senate.
Okay.
Yeah.
He's correct.
Against.
A lot of presidents,
Good job, John.
Sununu never makes mistakes in numbers. I know. So this is the question. Maybe this is the case. I mean, I've never served in the White House. I'm down in the grassroots level and out in AID and all that, and out in the field. But I was impressed at one of these earlier reviews of the Bush administration, and it was about the Clean Air Act, that there were meetings in the White House every week of the staffs of the Congress with the White House staff to work out the legislation. And the president would drop in to see how the negotiation, this went on for weeks and weeks and weeks. Is that normal? I never heard, I don't think that's happened in recent history. Maybe it happens all the time. I know the congressional leaders at the top level meet with the president in the Oval Office, but they don't actually work out sentence by sentence what's going to be in legislation. Is it normal for the staffs of the Congress?
This was a very interesting experience because that was back in the days when administrations actually presented bills, drafted bills to the Congress. And we developed during early 1989 a over 600-page piece of draft legislation that was sent up to the Congress. John Dingell said he was not going to hold any hearings in the House because we couldn't get it through the Senate. So hearings were held by the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, and then the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee developed their own bill. Senator Mitchell, who was the majority leader, very much wanted a bill, but he didn't believe that he could bring the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee bill to the floor and get 60 votes. He wasn't going to bring the administration's bill to the floor with 60 votes. So he went to Bob Dole, the Republican leader, and asked him to join him in going to the president and proposing that they negotiate an administration leadership agreement. Mitchell would agree to have a majority of Democrats, Dole would agree to have a majority of Republicans, and the president would agree to the agreement. So we had 136 hours of negotiations in the majority leader's conference room during a month-long period. 99 of the 100 members of the Senate were in the room at one time or another. These negotiations were held at night. And there would be Republican senators on one side of the table, Democratic senators on the other side of the table. Mitchell and Dole would sit down the end, and I would sit down on the other end with Boyden Gray and Bob Grady and the Secretary of Energy, Jim Watkins, when he was available, and Bill Riley or Bill Rosenberg, and negotiate out over and over and again. Finally, we reached an agreement. I would come back every night and report to John Sununu and to the president what we had done the previous night. And we ended up producing a bill that passed on final passage by a vote of 89 to 11, with the overwhelming majority of Republicans and Democrats in favor of it. It was done because everybody was included in the negotiations. Everybody got something. And I don't think it would have happened without the leadership of George Bush, because this bill had been gridlocked for effectively 13 years because no one had figured out a way to get the 60 votes needed in the Senate. John Dingell kept his word, produced a bill in the House. We then went to a conference committee, hashed out the differences, and we got the largest piece of environmental legislation signed in history. And to his credit, George Bush gave a lot of kudos to the senators, Republican, Democrat, who had been willing to work with him and his administration in producing the bill. That's a classic example of how he worked as legislatively as president.
Okay, so it is
Can I add-
unusual. It was
Yeah,
a
can I
unique
add a little
situation.
bit?
Yes, go ahead, John.
Roger's too modest. I said in my book that the Clean Air Bill was really a creation of Roger Porter, and he really deserves credit for having worked all the details through it. It's a very technical bill, and I give George Bush credit. He really trusted Roger Porter and my comments back to him about what we should fight for and what we shouldn't fight for. He trusted me as an old engineer. He knew that we had passed a clean air bill in New Hampshire my last year as governor, and really took with faith, trusting his people to tell him that this was important to fight on. This was something you could yield on. And the key to that piece of legislation is that everybody identified things where they could give up a little to get a lot. And it is, I don't think that bill could be passed today. I don't think that bill could have been passed in the Reagan administration. I don't think that bill could have been passed without George Bush being president and having faith in his people to yield, if you will, on what may have seemed to be traditional positions that were unyieldable, and get a piece of legislation that worked. I don't remember the exact numbers, but it's something like this. I think we estimated a cost of like $2,000 a ton for abatement of emissions, and because this thing had cap and trade, which allowed industries to do their least expensive way of getting the maximum amount of savings, I think the costs end up around $200 or $300 a ton, all because I think George Bush had faith in his team, let us go up there and negotiate and give and take and come back with something instead of standing firm on phony positions that were unyielding. And it's a great example of a White House taking a lead on a very important piece of legislation and just grinding it out with staff hours and smart people to negotiate almost House district by House district and Senate state by Senate state nuances that took care of the needs of each of the legislatures and legislators in the House and Senate that had to vote on this bill.
Very interesting. We only have one question. Can politics ever return to the style of the two parties serving the greater good and compromising where it makes sense? Would anybody like to offer a comment on that? We do have 2 more hours that we can resolve this. Any comments from anyone?
Yeah, I think what has to happen for that to happen is the American public, and really public across the world, but the American public has to deal with the new communication norm that exists today. Social media drives people's response to political issues. People are, if you will, influenced. They are not they are not taught. And this idea of politics by influencers is a reality that we have to begin to understand. And then we have to begin to communicate in a way that uses that process in a civilized manner rather than an uncivilized manner. I've often said that Franklin Roosevelt discovered the radio, that John Kennedy discovered TV as a communications medium, that Barack Obama discovered social media, that Donald Trump manipulated social media, and now social media is out there being abused by people that want to inflame politics, then bring it back to the norm that we are all longing for. And I think it requires an educational conversion by the public to understand what has happened to themselves because of social media. In my opinion, it will come, but it won't come quickly.
Any other comments from anyone?
Let me
Yes.
say I have a great faith in the American people for their good sense. And if you look back through American history, there are waves of political rancor that in many ways were much worse than today. To look at the Reconstruction period or the Gilded Age of the late 19th century is to realize that things then were far more partisan, far more bitter, far more divisive than today. And yet it was followed by the era of Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, and later on by Franklin Roosevelt, so that the country does have the ability to turn around. It all depends on people. What people mess up, people can correct.
One last comment is the perception is that this populist thing we're going through now is unique. It is not unique at all. After every major economic crisis, I don't mean a small depression, recession, I mean a major depression like the 1930s. There was one in the 1790s, there was one in the 1830s, there was one after the Civil War, and each one was followed by a huge increase in isolationism, nativism, ultranationalism, a whole bunch of dysfunctional things were at work. The protectionism at the end of the beginning of the Depression. The same thing is happening now that happened then. Those are the normal reactions we have when there are major down. We've had two major economic crises, 2008 and then COVID. And they're not separated by 50 years, they're separated by 10 years or 12 years. And my own opinion is, if I can offer it, is that we are just experiencing what's happened 4 or 5 other times in U.S. history, and I think we will grow out of it, frankly. That's my opinion.
I hope very much that your optimism is sound, and I like to share it. I would simply add one further observation. One of the big tasks of a president is to educate people as to what their real choices are. If you look at social media, most of what comes across in social media is what I call messaging. It's trying to articulate a particular point of view, not to explain what our real choices are. And most of the messaging is that the solution to every problem is simple and straightforward and relatively easy if only other people would do what I want them to do. Well, that's not going to work. And it doesn't work in a democratic political system, and it never will. And therefore, it's going to require a president who is prepared to educate people as to what our real choices are. And right now, we've got a huge demographic challenge that we share with large numbers of countries around the world, where the systems that we have in place are not going to be capable of sustaining the set of entitlement programs that we have. And we're going to have to make some changes. They will either be forced on us, or we can anticipate them and do it the easy way, or we can delay and do it the difficult way. Well, the only way to get people to do difficult things, there's never a good time to do difficult things. The only way to get them to do is to acquaint them with what the real facts are. And that's one of the things that is most important, in my view, in presidential leadership. And I hope very much, Andrew, that you were correct. And we will get back onto this new wave and see, because this is a great country. I wouldn't trade it for any other country in the world by far. But it's going to take a president who's prepared to lead by giving us a real sense of what our genuine, realistic choices are and help us understand which path we ought to take.
Other comments from anyone? Well, thank you all for coming this evening. It's almost exactly 2 hours, a long time, but I think there's a lot of interesting stories and good substance this evening. Thank you for participating.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you. John?
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all, gentlemen.
Yes.
Bye-bye.